So today we're going to talk about short-term memory, and we're actually going to do some experiments so you can test your own memory and learn about some of the features of short-term or working memory through that process. So while we're doing these experiments, remember not to cheat. So you shouldn't be able to see the information that in one of them I'll use a couple of slides and have you write down what you saw. You shouldn't be able to see it, but just in case it stays up on your end, make sure you look away. And when I'm reading two of the experiments, I'll read a list of items. Make sure I've finished reading the items before you write them down. So the first one is a string of numbers. So I'm going to read the string of numbers, and I want you to try to remember them long enough to write them down. So here we go. 3, 9, 8, 7, 4, 3, 2, 9, 4, 1, 3, 4, go. So if you are like most people, you probably remembered about 7 items. The type of memory you just used for this task is short-term or working memory. So it lasts about 30 seconds or less and can hold 7 plus or minus 2 items. And this is a good way to remember what this type of memory is. If you hadn't rehearsed that string of numbers, you wouldn't continue to remember them after 30 seconds. You would have to work pretty hard to keep, even if you only remembered 7 of them, you'd still have to work to keep that in memory, in your working memory, or you'd have to transfer it to long-term memory. So remembering a list of items that you just heard long enough to write them down is a great example of what working memory is. So in the next, working or short-term memory, and remember that your book uses those terms differently, where short-term memory is the passive storage of information for 30 seconds or less, and working memory is a separate sort of entity, the way they describe it, and it includes that processing of information, making sense of it, sketching it out, making decisions about what to pay attention to. But theoretically, in my opinion anyways, and it's different in every book you read, but working and short-term memory are essentially the same thing. But it's just two different functions of that conscious operating space that we call our short-term or working memory. So here's another memory experiment, and this time there are going to be letters, and they're going to come up on your screen. So they'll come up on your screen for just a brief period, and then I'll take them off your screen, and you can remember them long enough to write them down. So here we go. So here they are again, but this time I've organized them differently. So I imagine that you had an easier time remembering the letters the second time. And the reason they were easier is because of a couple important truths of memory. And the first is that meaningful information is easier to remember. I gave you chunks of information in the second example that you recognize and that are connected to lots of other concepts in a web of association in your brain. So it's easier to find that information when you go to look for it, and it's easier to put it in your mind in a meaningful way. Whereas the first time, you just had a string of random numbers and there were too many V's and too many C's and it all seemed disconnected. And this is important to remember in terms of your own memory, and as you study for class, you can reduce the work you need to do by starting off with your big chunks. Start by organizing the information for each chapter or unit you're studying into big topic areas, and then start filing the information in those topic areas as you learn it. So instead of having a string of random information to remember, you have meaningful chunks of information. So for example, with this chapter, you would start with your 3 processes of memory, which are encoding, storage, and retrieval, and that would be one chunk. And your next chunk would be the 3 types or stages of memory. So keeping that in mind as a way of organizing the information in your memory. So I have one more memory experiment, and this one I'm going to read a list of words, and I want you to try to remember them long enough to write them down. And remember, don't start writing until I finish reading the list. Here we go. Dream, bed, quiet, tranquil, rest, night, hubcap, toss, turn, pillow, pajamas, blanket, snore, bed, go. So the memory truths that we learned this time, first of all, probably all of you remembered the word hubcap, and that's because it didn't fit with the other words. That's because it requires more effort to process, and that's known as the Restorff effect. You also may have remembered the word sleep. It's very common for students to remember the word sleep, even though I did not actually say that word. Usually in a class, a live class, about 40 to 60% of students, more than half usually, will remember, quote unquote, the word sleep. And that's because all the words on the list had to do with sleep, and you expected me to say the word sleep. It's great evidence of how we actually actively construct our memories. They don't work like a tape recorder or a video recorder. They work by our expectations and the influence of our schemas. Our schemas are sets of information about things. So schemas influence our thinking and our memory. We expected to have heard the word sleep, so it's very common to actually hear that word.